This is Pastor Brian. We are so glad that you have joined us today and that you are watching online. Our goal is to help you to know and love God more. But in no way is this a replacement for your connection to a local church. If you don't belong to a church, we would be glad to help you in whatever way we can connect to others who are walking through faith and can be a support and help to you. If this sermon is a blessing to you, would you please comment below? Also, if you have any prayer requests or concerns, let us know and we'd be glad to join you in prayer. We pray that God will speak to you through this message. So today, where do you start in a series called Creation to Christ other than with creation? So that's where we're going to be today. And I want you to picture this. I want you to, I wish we could close the windows and make you think of this a little bit better. But have you ever just sat and stared at the night sky? The beautiful stars, the stark contrast of the light and the darkness, and just sat there and in awe of it. There's many who sit and look at the vastness of the night sky and they wonder, they themselves, they sit there and ask many questions. They have deep thoughts late at night looking at the universe on display. And that's the way I feel when we read Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. I look at the story of creation and there's vastness, there's wonder, there's awesomeness present here. And I just want you to see some of it as we look at these verses. We're going to read Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and then we're going to jump down to 26 and read the rest of the way through. Not that I'm going to skip over these parts, but it gets a little repetitive, and you can read this in your personal devotion. So for time's sake, we're going to look at this. So Genesis chapter 1, starting in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of these waters. And just to highlight, verse 3, then God said, let there be light. Verse 8, then God said, let there be expanse between the water. Verse 9, then God said, let the water under the sky gather in one place and let the dry land appear. Verse 14, then God said, let there be light in the expanse of the sky to separate the day and the night. And then verse 20, God said, let the waters swarm with living creatures and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. Verse 24, then God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kind. And that's where we get to verse 26, and this is where we're going to read the rest of it. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And they will rule the fish of the seas, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image, and he created him in the image of God, and he created them male and female. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. God said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seeds. This will be food for you, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it. And I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. Then God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came and morning, the sixth day of creation. I look at this story, and Genesis chapter 2 is kind of a refresh of that story and more details about how he made man and woman, and humanity is there. And I just look at this story and I stand amazed at it. It's in awe of it. No other story in the Old Testament has created more thought, more discussion, and yes, even more controversy than this one. The creation story is full of many details that make us think, make us wonder how God can do this, how this all works. How was it that there was nothing and then there was something? I don't understand all of this. And that's okay. But this is supposed to be for us to learn and to see God reveal himself to us. And if you are interested, I can and will share with you some of those details of how to answer some of the controversies, more of the creation theory and science and how they work together, or maybe creation and evolution and can they exist and what does that look like? Because science tells us everything comes through evolution. And how do you argue with science? And I can actually share with you some of those things. I can share with you the historical evidence of a creation. But for time's sake, and some of you may not be interested in all those details, so I'm not going to share with you every single thing right now. But if you are interested, I love to share these things. I love to look at this aspect because in it, all that I see is miracles. Things that only God can do. Things that reveal God through creation. And so as we go back to the whole idea that staring at the night sky or staring at creation, it brings up thoughts and questions and discussions. As we read this, I kind of go back to that this creation story brings up some of those questions. Is it in fact history? Is it a recollection of exactly how it happened? Is it science? Is this like you can read it as a textbook and this is science proven over and over again? Is this in fact a myth or a fable just told like many ancient civilizations just to give an answer to how we became? Well, I land somewhere of it's maybe a little of all of those, but not exactly any of those. Because the Bible is not a history book, and it's not a science book. It's not a textbook for us to get all those answers that we can, give on a test and prove that we know these things absolutely. The Bible is the revelation of God. God revealing himself to us. And that's where it starts. God revealing himself to us. Honestly, I think Christians consider these things. They think about these things too little. They don't look at creation. We don't look at creation enough and just stand in awe. I love the worship songs we sang this morning because they were all about creation. They mentioned all about how everything is created by God, and it causes us to think about God. And so because many Christians don't think about creation enough, we often don't think about God the Creator enough. The beauty, the splendor, the design of creation, they should all drive us to know and to love the God who created everything. Well, as we read the origin story, there are some things we must agree upon. In debate, there is something called presuppositions. There are ideas that we assume to be true without the evidence from any other source. And Genesis chapter 1 starts with a couple of presuppositions that we should consider today. And if you're going to look at creation, you should really consider these things. And the very first one is, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. We presuppose that God is, God was, God always has been, and always will be God. God is not created. God is not a being that has a start or an end. God has no beginning. God is God. There's no other word to describe God except God. And this is a presupposition. Many faiths, many beliefs, many religions have a God, and they all kind of have this idea that their God just exists. They don't have to answer it. They don't have to say, well, who made God? I always love the genuine faith of children when we're talking to them. And they always come up with that question. Well, who made God? Because there's no way I can answer that question. Like, there is no one made God. God just is God. And I love this. Here, Genesis chapter 1, it starts off, God first. In the beginning, God, and God is before all things. I love this. God is before all things. There is nothing and no one that equals God. He is all powerful. See, He created the heavens and the earth. He is all knowing. He knew even before it existed what was going to exist. It was in Him that all this was preconceived. That means He thought of this. This is out of God's imagination. And I love this when I think about creation, because imagine how God's imagination really exists, because He created the platypus, the hippopotamus. He created something as small as an ant or a termite. God created something as big as a blue whale. God considered all of the stars. I've always been amazed at this. I love the night sky, and I love looking at stars. And I've learned, many of the constellations and the name of the stars and stuff, especially when I was younger. So don't ask me now, because I forgot most of that. It's not as I just love it still. I actually had in elementary school, I had a star chart that actually I could rotate to the time and the day, and I could see the stars exactly how it was in the night sky. And I love that. I think I still have it in storage somewhere. I need to dig it out. But I love that. And then I'm amazed that, okay, we have names for all these stars. We have names for all these constellations. But then my mind goes to, I can't wait to get to heaven to hear what God named the stars. Because the Bible actually tells us that He knows all of the stars and He holds them in His hands. We know that constellations are out there and we have stories behind them that we made up. But imagine what God can tell us about how and why He put those constellations exactly how they are. My favorite is how the Big Dipper points to the Little Dipper, and the Little Dipper has the North Star. And that's how we can find true north. I love that. There is a design in creation. And God is before all. He is all-knowing. And the other thing is this, that God is all-powerful. He spoke and created these things. He is all-knowing. He imagined these things and created them. But He is all ever present. I'm not saying that in nature is God, but God is in nature. There's a difference. There are many who believe that in nature is God. God is there and you experience God through experiencing nature. I see it as in nature, God reveals Himself. God is outside of nature, but through His creation, it is His signature. It is the way He shows Himself. God is not in some tree or rock, and you cannot bow down to it or hold it and feel the presence of God. But in all of creation, we see the evidence that there is a God creator. Before any space dust, before any atoms ever existed, before any microbes, there was God. God is before all things. The other thing that in verse 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, I notice and I see this, God doesn't need anything. See, there's some who argue that in creation, God has to do these things. God is kind of motivated to do these things because God has a need for us to exist. That is not the truth. The truth is that God existed before creation and God will exist long after creation. God doesn't need us. God doesn't need the universe. God can exist without anything. He is not compelled or forced to create us, to create our world. But yet, in this, I see that creating, is in His nature. God is a creator. That's part of who He is. He is not forced to create, but He loves to create. He is not compelled to do these things, but He loves to do these things. Because it shows off who He is. When you look at nature, can you see the different aspects of God? When you look at the stars, when you look at the sky, when you're out there on the golf course or out on the lake fishing, or maybe you're sitting at home looking at the snow, do you see God created that because of who He is? Not because He was forced to. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need anything from us. So this answers the question that some have, that God needed to create a universe in order to rule. No, He didn't. God didn't need a universe to rule over. God didn't need a world to control or a people to manipulate. That's not who God is. God is self-sufficient. That means He can exist in and of Himself. He doesn't need anything. He is self-reliant. The only thing that God needs is God. We as human beings are not self-reliant. We're not self-existent. We need things. We need air to breathe. We need food to eat. Some of us more than others. But we need things. We need each other. We are not meant to do life alone. We cannot exist by ourselves. We cannot exist for ourselves. So the first presupposition is that God is. The second thing is that God created everything. That's the second presupposition, is that God created everything. God shaped the foundations of the universe just like a sculptor would do with clay. He would start with nothing and then take this glob, this goo, this formless object and shape it out and stretch it out and create something beautiful. That's what we see here. The earth was formless and empty, full of darkness that covered the surface. What surface? The surface of nothing. Literally, God started creating the universe with a blank canvas. See, I'm not much of an artist, but I have done some painting and some drawing. I'm not nearly as good as others who are in the room or who are in our church. But when I stare at a blank canvas, if I don't have someone kind of instructing me or showing me what to do, I get intimidated. A blank canvas is scary for me. And God sees a blank canvas and starts, there's a famous artist, Bob Ross, He just throws up colors and he's like, let's paint something happy. Let's make happy trees. I was like, I don't know what a happy tree is, but sure, let's try to draw that. Okay. But God looks at the blank canvas of the universe and starts speckling on the stars. Starts separating the sun and the moon, the day and the night. He starts shaping the world. And I love this, that as God created everything, the light, the water, the sun, the moon, the stars, the birds, the fish, it just says, then God said, let there be. God said, God spoke these things into existence. Yes, I know a lot of you like to skip over verse 26, or verse 25 especially. So God made everything according to their own kind, even the creepy, crawly creatures of the ground. Yes, God made spiders and snakes and every other thing that we have phobias of. God made it. And God created it and said, it is good. God made these things because God is a creator. And God made everything that exists. I love the verse that we read during our worship. Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. That for everything was created by Him, by God through Jesus Christ. Everything was created in heaven and on earth, the invisible and the visible. All things that have been created were created through Him and for Him. He is before all things, and by Him all things exist or hold together. God created everything. And then I love this, that God created everything from nothing. That God created everything from nothing. See, God didn't take something that was already there. As some like to say that something had to, those molecules and those space dust, they just always existed. No, they didn't. There was nothing. There was absolutely nothing. In the original language, it's ex nihilo. There is nothing. Absolutely nothing. God did not take these things and modify them and play with their DNA or their structures and make something new out of something that already existed. That's not what Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 tell us. God created everything from nothing. He started with that blank canvas and designed everything that we see, everything that we know. There is an absolute beginning to all of existence. There's no beginning or end to God, but as far as our existence, as far as every molecule, every atom, everything that we know and that we even don't know yet about the universe has a beginning point. It exists because God created it at that time. There was nothing before. And so God created. There's an absolute beginning when everything came into existence. And Genesis is really the only one that tells us some of the details of the beginning of everything. The beginning of time. God began time. He started the clock. He wound it up and said, now here's how time's going to exist. The first day and evening, he created time. He created space as far as the universe. He put the stars into place. I mean, I don't know how else to explain this, but everything points to God, creator. Even many scientists have to conclude, when you get down to the basis of it, even if they believe and promote and teach the Big Bang Theory, you get down to who created everything, or when did these things all come into existence that could collide and create the universe that we know of, and they have to concede at one point there is some part of this aspect that we do not know, we can't understand, we don't see, or we can't explain how it started. And I have video proof of many scientists saying exactly that. We don't know many of the answers to the questions about the creation or the beginning of existence. But what I find fascinating about all this, as I read Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, and I see God at work and God creating everything, it shows the complexity of God. See, God is both simple and complex all at the same time. Biology can tell us the details of the body and how plants and animals and even the human experience, we can point out all these little things that we know for sure about biology. It is simple to understand, but yet the more you understand it, the more complex it is. Like we teach preschoolers all about, these are fingers, this is your arm. But yet when you get into the upper levels of understanding this, like how bone is formed, how muscles exist and attach to, all from the same strand of DNA. All these things can exist. It shows the complexity of God. God is, God was, and God will ever be. That is simple to understand. God is God. But yet with that statement, God being God, is so complex. What do you mean God is God? God is the God over everything. God is the God that is self-sufficient and self-reliant. But yet God loves us so much that he created us. God loves us so much that he created everything. And I love this, that even though we don't understand everything about God, we can marvel at his awesomeness. We can look at this and be amazed at who he is and what he has demonstrated in creation. I really hope that when we get up to heaven, like we get to watch the movie version of the beginning of everything. Because I would love to see how God just spoke and things existed. Especially with God narrating the whole thing. You know, we love to have narrators on some of these movies and videos. James Earl Jones has a great voice. We have many others. Morgan Freeman. I mean, could you imagine something like that? God's calm, deep voice explaining the existence of creation to us. I would love that. But I also love this. Again, we see that God has the creator in his nature. He is a creator by his nature. Everything is made by God in this instance. And Isaiah 43 verse 19 says, "Behold, I am doing something new." He has not stopped creating. He did not start the world over here and say, "This is all good. Now I'm going to just stop and walk away." He still creates today. You look at a brand new baby and are amazed that there is no other person in all of history, and there will be no other person in all of the future that has that child's DNA, that has the characteristics that that child has in him or her. There is nothing else, except for God has created us. And God creates. There's still so much of creation we are discovering and learning. There's still new species on earth that have been here since the beginning, but we haven't seen them or know them, and science is still discovering them. It's because God is still creating. God is still making something new. Also, I see in this passage, in all of the scripture, everything that God has created is for good. God created everything, and he said, "It is good." Every single detail of creation, every moment of creation, he stops and he looks back and he says, "It is good." See, when I've been doing painting, I look back at what I was painting and I was like, "That's not good." And then I go back and try to fix it, and the more I try to fix it, the worse it gets. But God says, here's light and darkness. It's good. Here's the sun and the moon and the stars. It is good. Here's land and water and sky. It is good. Everything God made is good because God is eternally good. And since God is eternally good, the only thing he could create is goodness. Every aspect of creation is indeed a blessing. I love this. Someone asked me one time, he's like, "How can you know for a fact there is a God?" I was like, "Well, it's very easy. Everywhere I look, I see the fingerprints of God." You're like, "What do you mean, the fingerprints of God?" Does God have fingerprints like we do? Well, kind of. See, a long time ago, a scientist, a mathematician, found out that there is a sequence that is of perfection that is found throughout all of nature. It's called the Fibonacci sequence. If you know anything about it, if any of you are math people, you will understand 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. And you're like, what do any of those mean? Well, for those who are mathematicians, you know that if you take the previous number and add it to the current number, you get the next number. 1 plus 1 equals 2. 1 plus 2 equals 3. 2 plus 3 equals 5. 3 plus 5 equals 8. And it keeps going on forever. It is a direct proportion of something, and it's found all throughout nature. As an example here, we can see this on the pictures. You see it on the ram's horn. This is the fingerprints of God. It is a direct proportion. If you were to overlay the Fibonacci sequence in math, it is exactly that. You see this in flowers, in plants. You see it here with a sunflower with all of its seeds, or with this plant. It is a direct spiral, and the more that it grows, the more that it is perfectly proportionate to the previous level, or the previous ring. You see it in seahorses. Those are amazing creatures that I do not understand anything about. Like, why do we call them horses? You can't ride them. Anyways. But not only do we see it in plants and animals, but we see it in planets and solar systems. We see it in hurricanes. That perfect spiral that you see on a hurricane is exactly the Fibonacci sequence. We also see this in us. Our facial features are directly proportionate. I know that all of our faces are different, but according to itself, we are directly proportionate to ourselves. We're not like each other. And of course, there's another term called asymmetrical, which means it doesn't match up exactly. But if you were to take half of your face, I mean, I could show you all the research. I could tell you don't get this and you may not understand it. But we see this as the Fibonacci sequence all throughout nature. And this is what is known as the actual fingerprint of God. It happens so randomly, but yet it cannot be explained. Why is this perfect sequence found in ocean waves and in sand and in plants and in animals and in human features? How is this that it's all the way out in the solar system, but yet it's also all the way down to the subatomic level that we see this perfect, proportionate sequence, and that is the fingerprint of God. It points to exactly a perfect God, creator, who made everything to be good. And so nowhere else is this seen better, that there is a God who's created us and created everything out of nothing and created it to be good. There's nowhere else that we see this than in the pinnacle of all creation, humanity. I love the creation story. As we get down, then God said, "Let us make man in our own image." And he created them in the image of God, and he created them male and female. We are made in the image of God. Humanity is special out of all creation. We did not evolve. Oh, I know, science tells us, well, how else would you explain 98% of our DNA structure is exactly that of other animal creatures? Well, that's because it's still the same artist who's designing us that designed all of the animals. You know how you can tell a painting is made by a famous artist? Because the brush strokes are the same exact as what they were in other paintings. The painting is extremely different, but the brush strokes and the way that it's painted is exactly the same. It's true of God. The base DNA, he didn't have to fix anything to create all of creation, because in the base was the existence of everything, but yet each thing is specifically made after its own kind, according to the Bible. But we are made by him and for him. To go back to Colossians chapter 1. We are made by him and for him. We are the pinnacle of creation. Notice that everything else, all of creation, the light, the darkness, the land, the oceans, the space, everything that was made in here, he says that all of it was made for us. He created mankind, and he says, now you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth, because all of it, the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the creatures that crawl on the ground, everything was given to you. That's yours. Everything is made through him and for him. We are made through him and for him, but he created everything for us. That's how much he loves us. That's how much we are made in his image. Everything. There's something else in Genesis chapter 1 I've noticed as I was studying and researching this. I was like going through and reading all of it in great detail. And I noticed that God said, let there be light and darkness. God said, let there be expanse between the waters. He separated the heavens and the earth. God said, let all the things under the water be gathered into one place in the ocean, and let dry land appear. He created the land. Then God said, but if you read chapter 2, the God actually took dust from the ground and created us. He didn't speak us into existence. He got his hands dirty with us. And then he, especially with guys, he got us real dirty. He made us out of dust. And then he was a little nicer for women. He just took the rib from the guy and created the woman. So take it however you want it. But what I see here is that humanity is different from all creation because God got his hands dirty with us. God had his hands involved in the very creation of men and women. God spoke everything else into existence, but God says, this people, Adam and Eve specifically, but all of people, is so important that I'm not just going to speak into existence, I'm going to mold it by my own hands. I'm going to touch this part of creation differently and make it differently because they are special. See, God reveals his majesty throughout all of creation, but he reveals himself through humanity. From the very beginning, God was willing to get close to us, whereas all the rest of creation is different. And his fingerprints, if we go back to Fibonacci's sequence, his fingerprints are all over us. But more than just the Fibonacci sequence, we see that we are inherently different than all the rest of creation. Our minds are different. Our bodies are different. Our emotions are different. Our intellect is different. Our very soul is different than any other part of creation. We are made in his image, which means we are made after God. Not to be gods, but to know God. We get an experience different than the rest of the creation. Being made in the image of God also means that we are made to be creators. We are made to be good. We are made to be eternal. And so, as we think about these things, as we consider creation, from the very beginning of the Bible, we are tested with this. With two questions. Number one, do you believe the Bible? Do you believe the Bible is true? Do you believe the Bible's story of creation? Do you believe? If you believe the Bible, then the second question is, do you believe that God exists? Because if you believe the Bible, it starts with God. It ends with God. It reveals God throughout everything. And I love this. Romans chapter 1 verse 20 says, Paul says this. He says, for the invisible attributes of God, that is God's eternal power and God's divine nature, have been seen clearly through creation, being understood through what he has made. And as a result, we are without excuse when it comes to whether God is real or not. So as we think of these things, as we consider creation, is the Bible true? Does God really exist for you?